Hello. So now that you've had a chance to view over the the beginning of the Depression, we looked at the stock market crash and the situation that we entered economically. So even though it was an economic situation where a lot of people lost their money in the stock market crash, the impact of that was also felt socially and politically. And when we go through this presentation, you'll be able to see what impacts it had. And it continued for quite some time. World War II was actually looked at as kind of like an economic relief because whenever there is war, at the end of the war, we see a boom. So oftentimes there's a lot of political, social, and economic intertwine that happens at the government level. So let's see what it was like living in Canada during the Depression. So we know that this is what the inside, if you do remember, I showed you a picture of the pogie. So men would come inside and they would get a hot meal. And as you can see, it's men. So what about the women? I'm always trying to ask you guys about, and I still want you to think about, who is it that's not represented in the picture and what story is there that we have to tell about them? So where are the immigrants? Where are colored people? Where are Aboriginal people in this scenario over here? And it's very interesting because we can say that we might be able to find their stories, but do we find visuals as easily as we do? So people use their cameras and they take pictures of things that they think are important. So the photos that are available of history are also something that we have to think about in terms of absence and what it is that we can't see. Many referred to the Great Depression as the Dirty 30s, and this is actually a picture of a water fountain that you would find probably in Canada and within the United States. While we might have been the paradise that landed people at the Underground Railroad, we were the end of that line and considered to be the paradise. This was still very prevalent in Canada. It's just, again, what evidence is there of that and what story do we choose to tell about Canada? In actuality, the first victims of the Depression were women, Black Canadians and Aboriginal people. They found new ways to organize and express and support themselves. But as of the 1930s ended, their struggles to find genuine and secure place in Canadian society continued. So when there was a scarcity of resources, the movement that was made in the 1920s, or possibly the entrance of maybe some Black Canadians into some professional schools, they found that it was into some professional schools that kind of ended in the 1930s, where people started to focus on that lack or that sense of survival rather than looking at the social and political developments that had happened in the past 10 years. So here we have a picture of the pogie again. Sometimes you'll see that there are restaurants that would give out food at the beginning or the end of the day. And we saw a lot of that charity and camaraderie, similar to what we see today. There are many posts on Facebook and social media where we say, look, if there's a woman who's living at home and is being abused and during this pandemic, you can just call me and say that you need makeup, specifically lipstick. I read that somewhere. Another one, some other posts that I've read, that if you can't have access to groceries, you can contact us and we'll deliver them to you. So we see that in the social or the cultural aspects of Canadian society continued actually from the Great Depression. And as I explained in the last lesson that I posted for you guys, was that we were looking at not only having our market completely crash, but also we had a drought in the prairies, which was Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The crops became so dry and dusty that we weren't able to grow for quite a significant period of time. What that meant is that we had lost a lot of crops, and because of that, we didn't have any to sell, which further deteriorated our economy. And R.B. Bennett was actually Prime Minister during the Great Depression, and he promised all of these things to help Canadians along, and nobody really believed him. And one of the running jokes of the Depression, and if we were going to have a test, you would have seen this on there, was called a Bennett buggy. So if we do remember, in the 1920s, a lot of people had started to buy Model T Fords, and cars became more common, and the development and infrastructure of transportation was beginning to change. But then people weren't able to afford gas. So what they would do is they would attach their Model T Ford to a horse and go back to horse and carriage. And then they started to call that a Bennett buggy. People, believe it or not, that people came together in the diversity of depression. And I'm sure that you see that as well. Even today, where people, and I told you about those acts of kindness, and also having Zoom birthday parties, and finding a way to still continue to communicate and interact with one another. Motion pictures with complete sound started to come out. Canadians could find 25 cents to 50 cents could see an Alberta-born actress, and her name was Fay Wray. And she was in the movie King Kong. Another notable movies during this time period was Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. And entertainment was something which was affordable and took up a lot of time, which is what people had because they weren't able to go to work. Sound familiar? And from everybody, Germany was probably the country that suffered the most in the stock market crash and throughout the Depression. They were finding it difficult and almost impossible to repay those loans. They weren't happy with what the government had done, and they were screaming for help. So during the war, the Fuhrer at the time, who was the Schieffelin, what he did was the Fuhrer went ahead, Schieffelin was the Minister of Militia for Germany, but what they went ahead and did was they kind of wiped out the entire German economy. And we know that making Germany pay for the war reparation payments was unfair. The German people knew it as well, and they weren't really able to kind of make themselves feel better. And believe it or not, if Germany had continued making the war reparation payments, it would have been in 2010 that would have finished. And it was equivalent to 96,000 tons of gold. And our response to the Depression, at the beginning of the Depression and the stock market crash, Mackenzie King was our prime minister, and he says, business was never better. Don't worry about it. We're all good. You know, kind of like Donald Trump. I don't need to wear a mask. Why do I need to wear a mask? So that kind of thing. Also, what Prime Minister Bennett tried to do to resolve the Depression after Mackenzie King lost the election was he tried to create relief camps. So relief camps is where thousands of single homeless men we found were running around. And many believed that they were going to be creating a lot of tension or issues within society because they had nothing to do. So these relief camps were set up where men could work and then would have free room and board in order to make a little bit of extra money. But didn't really look out the way that we expected it to. The government set these up in the deep parts of the Canadian wilderness. It was kind of scary, was expecting men to, cut wood all day. It was very laborious, and some men weren't really up for that. It was a really small budget. They were given food, shelter, army-style clothing for 20 cents a day. But everybody was really upset. They wanted the government to be able to do something about it, that there wasn't enough money, and what can we do to help them along? So if you probably know, you've heard of CERB, which is the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. And the Canadian government very quickly laid out a lot of the benefits that would be available to people who have been affected economically by the pandemic. This was a very quick response because we see government in action learning from their mistakes. Historically, when we were dealing with the Depression and we were dealing with a huge economic downturn, the last time that really happened was in the 1930s. And the on-track to Ottawa was people, citizens, demanding help from their government. So Trudeau's response to this was immediate, and it is directly you being able to see a lesson being repeated and history repeating itself and us learning from that lesson. So not only was there the on trek to Ottawa where people kind of ride the rails and they jumped on the trains and they headed over to Ottawa, there was also the Regina riot, which broke out between police and protesters. And it left only one strike leader was permitted to carry on to Ottawa to meet with the unfriendly prime minister we felt at the time. There was no changes that could have happened. And then at the end of the Depression, people were so upset with Bennett, they ended up wanting to re-elect Mackenzie King, hence him being our prime minister during World War II. So that's the way that the Great Depression went. And it wasn't a good time to live at all. But I'm wondering what I'm going to do is put up a Jamboard and tell me the similarities that you find between living today and living during the Depression. I'm also going to post a worksheet that I would give you if we were to watch a movie called Cinderella Man in class. I'll try to see if I can find a link to the movie somewhere online, but I'll put up there. And if you get a chance to watch the movie, if you're free, try it out and see what happens. It's a really neat movie for you to see what culture and society was like during the Depression. Hope everybody is safe and happy, and if you ever need anything, please let me know. Have a great day. Thanks.